Welcome to Calm Mysteries, a quiet place where forgotten history, lost kingdoms, and unsolved secrets drift softly through time. There is nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to remember. Just listen, relax, and let the past carry you gently into sleep. The message carved into stone and ignored. The wind scraped across the basalt cliff face like fingernails on slate, carrying with it the smell of distant rain and crushed juniper. Sarah Winters pressed her palm against the rock, feeling the afternoon heat radiating through worn leather gloves. The petroglyphs stared back at her with the indifference of millennia, their meanings as opaque as ever, despite 3 summers of documentation work. She had catalogued 217 distinct symbols across this canyon system, photographed them from every conceivable angle, measured their dimensions with digital precision, and still they remained fundamentally mysterious. That was the nature of her work, she supposed. You collected data points like a miser hoarding coins, hoping that one day the accumulated weight of evidence would tip the scales toward understanding. "Found something," called Michael from 40 feet below, his voice echoing off the narrow canyon walls. He was crouched near a tumble of boulders that had probably fallen from the cliff face sometime in the past 500 years, give or take a century. His blonde hair caught the light like wheat as he brushed away centuries of dust with a soft bristled brush that had cost $67 at a specialty archaeology supply store. Sarah made her way down the slope, boots skidding slightly on loose grey. The university had given her a grant of $43,000 for this season's field work, and she'd spent most of it on equipment, permits, and the services of 3 graduate students who were currently mapping sites 12 miles north. Michael was the exception, a linguistics postdoc from Berkeley who joined the project because his girlfriend had dumped him, and he'd needed to get out of California for the summer. He approached ancient languages with the intensity of someone trying to prove something, though Sarah had never quite figured out what. "Look at this," Michael said as she approached. He'd uncovered a flat section of rock about 3 feet square, protected from the elements by its position beneath the boulder overhang. The petroglyphs here were remarkably well preserved, their edges still sharp enough to catch shadows in the late afternoon light. But it wasn't the quality of preservation that made Sarah's breath catch. It was the complexity of the composition. Most rock art in this region consisted of relatively simple geometric shapes, animal figures, or anthropomorphic forms. Handprints were common. Spirals appeared frequently. The occasional hunting scene might show tiny stick-figure humans pursuing game with spears or atlatls, but this was different. This was dense with information, layer upon layer of symbols arranged in what appeared to be deliberate rows. It reminded Sarah of text more than decoration, a comparison that made her professionally cautious. Too many amateur archaeologists had looked at Native American petroglyphs and seen what they wanted to see: secret messages, astronomical calculations, proof of ancient contact with distant civilizations. The truth was usually much simpler and much stranger than fantasy. "What do you think?" Michael asked. He'd pulled out his camera and was already documenting the find, the shutter clicking rapidly. "I think we need to be careful about interpretation," Sarah said, though her pulse had quickened. "Could be ceremonial, could be decorative, could be someone's way of passing time while waiting for game to appear. Come on, Sarah, look at the structure. This is organized communication, Michael's finger traced along the rows without quite touching the stone. See how the symbols repeat at regular intervals? And here, this sequence appears 3 times with minor variations. That's pattern. That's language trying to say something. Sarah wanted to argue, but he wasn't wrong. She'd seen thousands of petroglyphs across the American Southwest, from the Columbia River Gorge down to the Gila River country, and this was unusual. The symbols themselves were familiar enough. Concentric circles, zigzag lines, anthropomorphic figures with elaborate headdresses, what might have been representations of animals or spirits, but their arrangement suggested deliberate composition rather than accumulation over time. "We'll document it properly," she said. "Full photographic record, 3-dimensional scanning if we can get the equipment up here. I'll contact Dr. Yamamoto at the Linguistics Institute. She's done work on Puebloan iconography that might be relevant." They worked until the sun dropped behind the western rim of the canyon, painting the rock walls in shades of amber and rust. Sarah took measurements while Michael photographed from multiple angles, adjusting his position to catch the way shadows fell across the carved lines. By the time they packed up their equipment, the light had faded to the point where headlamps were necessary for the hike back to their field camp. The camp consisted of 4 tents arranged around a central fire pit, powered by a portable generator that had cost $900 and broke down with depressing regularity. Sarah's tent served as both sleeping quarters and mobile office, filled with laptops, external hard drives, and stacks of archaeological journals in plastic protective sleeves. She fired up the generator and spent 2 hours uploading the day's photographs to cloud storage, paranoid about losing data to theft or equipment failure. Academic careers had foundered on less. Michael appeared at her tent flap around 10 o'clock, carrying 2 bottles of beer that had stayed moderately cool in their inadequate cooler. "Want to look at these together?" They sat in camping chairs under a sky crowded with stars, laptop balanced between them, clicking through the images. The petroglyphs seemed even more enigmatic on screen, reduced to pixels, but somehow more present, more insistent. Sarah had spent enough time with rock art to know that meaning could be slippery. What looked like a bighorn sheep to modern eyes might have represented a completely different concept to the people who carved it. The human impulse to find messages in ambiguity was powerful and often misleading. "Humor me for a minute," Michael said. "Let's say this is actually a message. What would it be trying to communicate?" "We don't know when it was carved," Sarah countered. "Could be 800 years old, could be 2000. Without excavation and context, we're just guessing. But the style is consistent with the basket maker period, right? Maybe around 500 AD to 700 AD. Sarah nodded reluctantly. The associated ceramic fragments they'd found in the area suggested an occupation during that time frame, when the ancestral Puebloan peoples were transitioning from a mobile hunting and gathering lifestyle to more sedentary agricultural communities. It was a period of significant cultural change, which sometimes manifested in elaborate rock art traditions. So if someone around 1500 years ago wanted to leave a message for the future, Michael continued, what would be important enough to carve into stone? "Resources," Sarah said immediately. "Water sources, good hunting grounds, seasonal migration routes, warnings about dangerous animals or hostile groups, ceremonial knowledge, astronomical observations for tracking seasons." "Or a warning," Michael said quietly. Sarah turned to look at him. His face was illuminated by the laptop's glow, expression serious. What kind of warning? I don't know yet, but look at this sequence here. He pointed to a section near the bottom of the composition, where a series of wavy horizontal lines were stacked above each other, intersected by vertical marks that might have been counting notches. Water, right? That's pretty universal in rock art traditions. Multiple layers suggests abundance or flood. Or it could represent a river, Sarah said, or clouds, or the spirit world. We're projecting meaning based on our own cultural context. Maybe, but what about this? He zoomed in on another section where anthropomorphic figures appeared to be fleeing from something, their limbs extended in postures suggesting rapid movement. Behind them, a complex symbol Sarah couldn't immediately interpret seemed to loom over the scene. It was circular but irregular, with radiating lines that gave it an almost explosive quality. They argued gently for another hour, professional disagreement that never quite became personal, before exhaustion drove them to their respective tents. Sarah lay in her sleeping bag listening to the desert night, wind moving through sparse vegetation, distant coyote conversation, the occasional skitter of small creatures across stone. She thought about messages and meanings, about how human beings had been trying to communicate across time and space for as long as language existed. The petroglyphs were someone's voice calling across 15 centuries, and whether they'd been trying to warn or teach, or simply say, "We were here," the message had been effectively ignored by everyone who came after. She must have slept eventually, because morning arrived with Michael shaking her tent and announcing that they had visitors. Sarah emerged, squinting into sunlight to find an older man standing near the cold fire pit, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a canvas jacket despite the climbing temperature. He was Danae, she guessed, though she knew better than to make assumptions. His weathered face suggested someone who'd spent decades outdoors, and his expression conveyed patient amusement at her sleep-rumpled appearance. "Dr. Winters?" His voice carried the slight formality of someone conducting business. "I'm Thomas Begay. I heard you found something interesting up in the canyon." News traveled fast in rural communities, Sarah knew. Her permit applications had gone through the appropriate tribal authorities, and she'd made it clear that any significant discoveries would be shared with local communities before publication. Still, she hadn't expected anyone to show up at their camp so quickly. "Coffee?" she offered, gesturing toward their camp stove where Michael was already heating water. They sat on folding chairs while Sarah booted up her laptop and showed him the previous day's photographs. Thomas studied them in silence, his weathered face revealing nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. "My grandfather knew these canyons. He used to tell stories about the old places, the ones where the ancestors left messages." He tapped the screen where the fleeing figures were visible. This one, he called it the Warning Stone, said it marked something important that people had forgotten. Sarah's academic caution warred with excitement. "Did he say what kind of warning?" "Water," Thomas said simply. "He said it was about water, about what happens when there's too much and then too little, about cycles that repeat." He looked up from the screen. But nobody listened. The old people tried to tell the government engineers when they wanted to build the dam upstream. Said the patterns were wrong, that the river had its own rhythms that shouldn't be interrupted. But who listens to stories when there's money and development involved? The dam he referred to had been constructed in 1973, a massive concrete structure that regulated flow for irrigation and hydroelectric power. Sarah knew the basic history. Protests from environmental groups, concerns about impacts on downstream ecosystems, promises from the Army Corps of Engineers that everything had been properly studied and planned. The dam had operated successfully for 50 years, providing water and power to growing communities. "What happened with the dam?" Michael asked. Thomas's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Still there, still holding back the river, but the patterns are changing. We've had 3 major floods in the past 10 years, each one bigger than the last, and between floods, drought like nothing in living memory. The reservoir levels drop so low, you can see old canyons that were drowned when they filled it. Places with their own petroglyphs, their own messages. Sarah thought about climate data she'd read, about shifting precipitation patterns across the southwest. The science pointed toward increasing volatility, longer dry spells punctuated by intense rainfall that the landscape struggled to absorb. What had once been reliable seasonal patterns were becoming unpredictable, and infrastructure designed for yesterday's climate was proving inadequate for today's reality. "Can you tell me more about your grandfather's stories?" she asked. "I want to understand the context." Thomas considered this request, weighing something Sarah couldn't quite identify. Finally, he nodded. "I can show you some places, other stones with other messages, but you have to understand something." He paused, choosing words carefully. The people who carved these weren't trying to create a puzzle for archaeologists to solve. They were leaving instructions for survival. They'd lived through cycles before, understood patterns that took generations to complete, and they knew that forgetting was dangerous. They spent the next 3 days exploring the canyon system under Thomas's guidance. He led them to sites Sarah had never documented, hidden alcoves and sheltered overhangs where petroglyphs covered the rock in dense profusion. Some were clearly ceremonial, elaborate compositions involving masked figures and symbolic representations Sarah recognized from ethnographic literature on Puebloan religious practices. But others matched the pattern of the warning stone, complex arrangements of symbols that suggested narrative or instruction. At one site, high on a cliff face accessible only by ancient hand and toe, holds worn smooth by centuries of use, they found a sequence that Michael became convinced represented a calendar of some kind. Circles divided into segments, marks that might have tracked lunar cycles, geometric patterns that could have corresponded to solstices and equinoxes. Sarah remained skeptical of specific interpretations, but even she had to admit the mathematical precision suggested astronomical observation. They were tracking something, Michael insisted, multiple cycles overlaid on each other. Look at how this sequence repeats every 23 segments, and this one every 19. Those numbers are significant in lunar calculations. Thomas had climbed up with them despite his age, moving with the confidence of someone who'd grown up in this landscape. The old people understood time differently than we do now, he said. Not just days and months, but longer patterns. When the rains came, when game migrated, when the river flooded, they paid attention because their lives depended on it. Sarah photographed everything, her mind already racing ahead to analysis and publication. This was significant enough to justify expanding the project, maybe securing additional funding. But beneath the professional excitement ran a thread of unease. The warnings, if that's what they were, had been carved with urgency, repeated across multiple sites as though the ancient carvers wanted to ensure the message survived. and they'd been ignored, not through malice, but through simple disconnection from the systems of knowledge that had generated them. On the fourth day, Thomas led them to a site they'd driven past multiple times without noticing. It was tucked behind a fold in the canyon wall, accessible through a narrow cleft that required turning sideways to squeeze through. The chamber beyond opened up into a space about 20 feet across, its walls covered floor to ceiling with petroglyphs that showed clear evidence of creation over many centuries. Styles overlapped, early geometric forms overcarved with later figurative representations, the visual equivalent of a palimpsest. But at the back of the chamber, protected from direct exposure to the elements, was a panel that made Sarah's breath catch. It was enormous, perhaps 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, covered with symbols arranged in clear sections. At the top, wavy lines represented water. Below that, a series of anthropomorphic figures engaged in activities she could partly interpret: planting, harvesting, building structures. In the middle section, the water symbols returned, but more aggressively, overlaid with marks that suggested violence or disruption. The figures below appeared scattered, fleeing, and at the bottom, the final sequence showed simplified structures, fewer figures and symbols Sarah associated with scarcity or absence. "This is the story," Thomas said quietly. "The full version. My grandfather brought me here when I was 12 years old, told me what his grandfather had told him. It's about the cycle, about what happens when people forget that abundance doesn't last forever." Michael was already filming, his camera capturing details Sarah knew would require months to properly analyze. "What's the time frame?" he asked. "How long does the cycle take?" "Depends on what you're counting," Thomas replied. "The short cycle, the one between major droughts, might be 20 or 30 years, long enough that people forget the last one and make the same mistakes. But the big cycle, the one that changes everything, that takes longer, 3 generations, 4, long enough that the warnings carved into stone seem like ancient history instead of recent memory." Sarah studied the panel, trying to maintain scholarly detachment even as her mind raced. Archaeological evidence from the ancestral Puebloan world showed repeated patterns of expansion and contraction, periods when population grew and complex societies flourished, followed by droughts that forced abandonment of entire regions. The great houses at Chaco Canyon had been largely empty by 1250 AD, massive architectural achievements left to the elements as people dispersed in search of more reliable water sources. Similar patterns appeared across the Colorado Plateau, cycles of aggregation and dispersal that seemed to correlate with paleoclimatic data recovered from tree rings and lake sediments. "The people who carved this," she said slowly, "they'd experienced this cycle. They knew what was coming." "And they tried to warn everyone after," Thomas confirmed. "But warnings only work if people remember how to read them." They spent hours in that chamber, documenting every detail. Sarah's professional mind catalogued and categorized, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing in a library, whose language she only partly understood, surrounded by urgent messages she was failing to properly translate. The ancient carvers had encoded knowledge won through hardship and observation, left it in the most permanent medium they could access, and it had been rendered invisible through cultural discontinuity. That evening, back at camp, Sarah pulled up climate data on her laptop, while Michael prepared a simple dinner of beans and rice. She'd collected this information before starting the field season, but hadn't looked at it with the same intensity she was bringing now. The graphs showed what Thomas had described: increasing variability in precipitation, longer droughts punctuated by intense rainfall events that caused flooding. Reservoir levels in the Colorado River system had declined to levels not seen since the 1930s. Agricultural production across the Southwest was becoming less predictable, and the infrastructure designed for a stable climate, dams, irrigation systems, municipal water supplies, was showing signs of stress. "It's happening again," she said aloud. Michael looked up from the camp stove. "What is?" "The cycle. The same pattern the petroglyphs describe. Abundance, expansion, overuse, collapse. We built our civilization during an unusually wet period and assumed it would last forever. That's a pretty big extrapolation from some rock art," Michael said, but his tone was uncertain. "Is it? Think about what we've been seeing. Multiple sites, consistent messaging across centuries. They're trying to tell us something we've forgotten. That the environment we take for granted is temporary. That systems can feel. That warnings matter." She pulled up more data, compiling information she'd previously treated as background context. The dam Thomas had mentioned was approaching capacity issues, its reservoirs fluctuating wildly between drought-induced lows and flood-induced highs. Engineers were recommending upgrades and modifications, but the foundational assumptions about average snowpack, about seasonal runoff patterns, about predictable weather no longer held. The infrastructure was designed for a climate that no longer existed. Thomas returned to their camp that evening, appearing without preamble, as though he'd been expected. Sarah showed him the data she'd compiled, translating scientific graphs into plain language. He nodded slowly, unsurprised. "The old people would have recognized this," he said. "They watched the patterns, understood that what looked like chaos had its own rhythm, and they built flexibility into their lives. When one area failed, they moved. When the rains came back, they returned. But we've made ourselves rigid, built cities that can't move, agriculture that depends on constant water, economies that require continuous growth." "So what do we do?" Michael asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the darkness beyond their circle of lamplight. "First, you listen. Really listen to what the warnings are saying, not just what you want to hear. Then, you ask the right questions. Not, how do we maintain what we have, but how do we adapt to what's coming? The answer is in the stones if you know how to read it." Sarah spent the next week working with renewed intensity, documenting every sight Thomas showed them and connecting the patterns she was seeing. The petroglyphs weren't just artistic or religious expressions. They were a form of environmental record-keeping, a way of encoding observations about climate and resources that had been accumulated over centuries. The warning stone they'd first discovered was part of a larger network of information, messages scattered across the landscape like nodes in a distributed communication system. She began to see patterns in the positioning of sites. Many were located near water sources, but specifically near those that proved most reliable during drought. Others marked landscape features that suggested how ancestral populations had adapted their settlement patterns to environmental variability. The messages weren't prescriptions for specific actions. They were more like principles, ways of thinking about relationship to place and resource. They were teaching ecological literacy, she explained to Michael one evening, as they reviewed their documentation. not through abstract instruction, but through observation and pattern recognition. These panels are saying, pay attention to cycles. Remember that conditions change. Maintain flexibility. Don't overcommit to temporary abundance. That's a lot to read from some pictures on rocks, Michael said, though he sounded less skeptical than he would have a week earlier. Maybe we've been looking for the wrong kind of message. We expected written language, specific historical accounts. But what if this is more fundamental? What if they were trying to teach a way of seeing rather than a specific set of facts? The question haunted her as their field season drew to a close. She'd collected enough data for several years of analysis and publication. The discoveries would advance her career, establish her reputation as someone who'd identified a significant archaeological pattern. But beneath professional satisfaction ran a deeper concern. The warnings had been ignored, not once, but repeatedly. Each generation believing itself immune to the patterns that had shaped their ancestors' lives. On their final day in the canyon, Sarah climbed alone to the warning stone, the site where everything had begun. The petroglyphs looked the same as they had on that first afternoon, unchanged by her newfound understanding. She pressed her palm against the rock, feeling the heat absorbed from the sun, and thought about the person who'd carved these symbols 15 centuries ago. What had they felt, she wondered, as they worked stone against stone to leave this message? Hope that future generations would pay attention, resignation that they probably wouldn't, or simply an obligation to try, to encode what they knew in the most permanent form available? Her phone buzzed with a message from her department chair. A major foundation wanted to fund a multi-year project expanding her research. $500,000 over 3 years, enough to bring in additional researchers, conduct extensive surveys, maybe even begin excavation at promising sites. It was everything she'd worked toward. Validation that her approach had merit. Sarah typed a response accepting the funding, then added a line about shifting the project's focus. She wanted to bring in climate scientists, hydrologists, experts in traditional ecological knowledge. The goal wasn't just to document petroglyphs, but to understand them as environmental archives, sources of information about long-term climate patterns and adaptive strategies. If the warnings carved into stone had predicted the challenges they now faced, maybe they also contained hints about how to respond. She didn't know if it would make any difference. The petroglyphs had been ignored for centuries, their messages rendered invisible by cultural and temporal distance. Why would modern society listen now, when immediate concerns and short-term thinking dominated decision-making? But ignoring warnings didn't make them less true. The cycles would continue whether or not anyone remembered how to read the signs. The press conference took place 6 months later in a university auditorium, packed with more people than Sarah had expected. She prepared a presentation summarizing their findings, carefully hedging her interpretations with appropriate academic caution, while still conveying the significance of what they'd discovered. Michael stood beside her, ready to field questions about the linguistic analysis. Thomas Bigay sat in the front row, his presence a reminder that this knowledge wasn't new, just forgotten. Sarah clicked through images of petroglyphs, explaining their distribution across the landscape and the patterns she'd identified. What we're seeing is a sophisticated system of environmental monitoring and knowledge transmission. The ancestral Puebloan peoples developed ways of observing and recording climate patterns that unfolded over timescales longer than individual lifetimes. They weren't writing history in the way we think of it. They were encoding principles for survival. A journalist from a regional newspaper raised her hand. "Are you saying these rock carvings predicted climate change?" "No," Sarah said carefully. "I'm saying they documented cyclical patterns of drought and abundance that affected this region for millennia. The people who created these petroglyphs understood that environmental conditions fluctuate over long periods, and they developed adaptive strategies in response. What's relevant for us is that they tried to preserve this knowledge for future generations who might face similar challenges." "But those future generations didn't listen," the journalist pressed. "Why would we be any different?" It was the question Sarah had been wrestling with for months. "I don't know that we will be," she admitted, "but the difference now is that we have the tools to verify these patterns through multiple independent sources. The paleoclimatic data confirms what the petroglyphs suggest. This region experiences long-term cycles of drought and flooding that can't be adequately managed with infrastructure designed for short-term average conditions. The question is whether we'll adapt our systems to acknowledge these realities or continue assuming that the recent past is a reliable guide to the future." The presentation generated modest media coverage, mostly in local outlets focused on regional concerns. A few archaeology blogs picked up the story, praising Sarah's interdisciplinary approach, while noting that petroglyphic interpretation remained contentious. The broader world took little notice, too focused on immediate crises to pay much attention to warnings carved in stone 15 centuries ago. But something shifted in the academic community. Sarah's grant funding attracted attention from researchers working on long-term climate patterns, traditional ecological knowledge, and cultural resilience. Within a year, she'd assembled a collaborative team that included archaeologists, climatologists, anthropologists, and indigenous scholars. They began a systematic survey of rock art across the Colorado Plateau, documenting thousands of sites and looking for patterns that might reveal environmental information. The patterns emerged slowly, requiring months of analysis and cross-referencing, but they were there, consistent enough to be significant, even allowing for interpretive uncertainty. Certain symbols appeared at predictable intervals corresponding to drought cycles documented in tree ring data. Sites showing evidence of rapid abandonment correlated with periods of environmental stress. The petroglyphs weren't random artistic expressions. They were part of a cultural system for remembering and responding to environmental variability. "It's like they were building a distributed warning system," Michael explained during a team meeting 2 years into the expanded project. No single site contains all the information, but together they create a coherent picture of how the landscape behaves over centuries. And they placed these sites strategically near water sources and migration routes where future generations would be likely to see them. Dr. Elena Yamamoto, the linguist Sarah had originally hoped to consult, had become a core team member. Her work on Puebloan iconography provided crucial context for interpreting the symbolic systems they were documenting. "What's fascinating," she said, "is how this knowledge was embedded in daily practice. These weren't texts you had to be literate to understand. They were integrated into the landscape itself, part of how people learned to read their environment. You'd learn the meanings by traveling with elders, by hearing stories associated with specific places, by participating in ceremonies that reinforce the connections between symbols and survival strategies." "But that system broke down," Sarah said. "Disease, displacement, cultural disruption. The transmission chain was severed, and the knowledge became inaccessible. Thomas, who'd become an official project consultant, nodded slowly. Not entirely. Some families maintained the connections, passed down what they could. But yes, a lot was lost or suppressed, and now we're trying to recover it, using methods that would seem strange to the people who created it. The team published their findings in stages, each paper carefully documented and peer-reviewed. The response from the archaeological community was mixed. Some praised the innovative approach to understanding rock art as environmental archive. Others criticized what they saw as overinterpretation, arguing that Sarah and her team were seeing patterns that might be coincidental. The debate played out in academic journals and conference presentations, generating the kind of controversy that, while frustrating, at least meant people were paying attention. More practically, their work began influencing how resource managers thought about land use and water systems. Sarah was invited to present findings to tribal councils, state water authorities, and federal agencies responsible for managing Colorado River flows. She showed them the petroglyphs and explained what the symbols seemed to indicate about historical drought patterns. Some listened skeptically, others with guarded interest. A few recognized the implications immediately. "What you're describing," said an engineer from the Bureau of Reclamation during one such presentation, "suggests our entire infrastructure is based on faulty assumptions about water availability. If these drought cycles are as severe and prolonged as you're suggesting, we don't have the reservoir capacity to manage through them." "That's correct," Sarah confirmed. The dam system was designed during an unusually wet period in the mid-20th century. The engineers couldn't have known they were working with unrepresentative data, but the petroglyphs suggest their ancestral populations experienced mega droughts lasting decades. Our models need to account for that possibility. "So what do? We can't exactly rebuild the entire water system based on some rock carvings." Thomas spoke up from the back of the room. "No, but you can stop ignoring warnings when they're given. My people tried to tell your engineers this 50 years ago. The information was available if anyone had been willing to listen to sources outside their own expertise." The room fell silent. Sarah saw the engineer's face redden slightly, caught between professional defensiveness and the uncomfortable recognition that Thomas was right. How much suffering might have been prevented if traditional knowledge had been incorporated into planning processes instead of dismissed as folklore? How many communities were now facing water shortages because decision makers had assumed technological solutions could overcome environmental constraints? The meeting didn't produce immediate policy changes, but it planted seeds. Water managers began consulting with tribal nations about historical patterns and traditional knowledge of landscape behavior. Engineers started modeling for greater climate variability rather than assuming stable conditions. It was incremental change, frustratingly slow, but it represented a shift in thinking. Sarah continued fieldwork each summer, expanding the survey to adjacent regions and looking for connections between rock art, settlement patterns, and environmental data. Her team grew to include graduate students from multiple disciplines, all working to decode the messages in stone. They found more warning panels, more evidence of sophisticated environmental monitoring. And they found something else. Evidence that the ancient inhabitants had responded to changing conditions with remarkable flexibility. "Look at this," Michael said during their 4th summer season, gesturing at a complex of archaeological features spread across a high mesa. They'd excavated test units revealing multiple occupations spanning several centuries. The architectural styles change over time, suggesting different groups using this location, but they're all clustering around this specific spring, which our hydrological analysis suggests would have been reliable even during severe drought. They knew, Sarah said, studying the exposed features. They'd mapped which water sources could be trusted when everything else failed, and they shared that information, probably through the petroglyphs near the spring that show specific symbols we've now documented at other reliable water sources. It's a survival manual, Michael said, encoded in symbols and placed strategically across the landscape. If you knew how to read it, you'd know where to go when conditions deteriorated. But the crucial question remained unanswered. Would modern society adapt quickly enough to address the challenges that were already manifesting? The past 10 years had brought accelerating evidence that climate patterns were shifting faster than infrastructure could respond. The reservoirs behind major dams had dropped to historically low levels, forcing water rationing in cities that had grown large on promises of endless supply. Agricultural regions dependent on irrigation were failing, and the floods, when they came, were devastating, overwhelming systems designed for gentler weather. Sarah watched these developments with a mixture of vindication and frustration. The warnings had been there all along, carved into stone by people who understood what was coming, because they'd lived through it before. But warnings only mattered if anyone listened, and listening required humility, the willingness to accept that ancient knowledge might be more relevant than modern confidence. In the project's 5th year, something unexpected happened. A major documentary production company approached Sarah about creating a film exploring her research and its implications for contemporary water management. She was skeptical at first, wary of sensationalism and oversimplification, but the producer, a woman named Jennifer Chen, who'd grown up in the Southwest and remembered her grandmother's stories about Dust Bowl hardships, convinced Sarah that the story needed broader reach. People respond to narratives, Jennifer explained over coffee in a Flagstaff cafe. The scientific papers are important, but they don't grab public imagination. If we can show them the petroglyphs, help them understand what these warnings mean for their own lives, maybe we can generate the kind of pressure that forces policy change. The resulting documentary took 18 months to produce, filming across multiple locations and interviewing dozens of experts. Sarah worried constantly about how her work would be presented, whether the complexity would be preserved or reduced to simplistic narratives. But Jennifer proved careful and thorough, treating the subject matter with respect while making it accessible to general audiences. The film opened with a sequence showing the warning stone, the camera slowly panning across its surface, while Thomas's voice explained what his grandfather had taught him. Then it expanded outward, connecting the petroglyphs to archaeological evidence, to climate data, to contemporary water crises. Sarah appeared throughout, carefully explaining their findings and their implications. Michael provided linguistic context. Indigenous scholars discussed how traditional knowledge had been systematically dismissed. Water managers acknowledged the challenges they faced. The final sequence returned to the canyon, showing Sarah standing before the massive panel they'd discovered in the hidden chamber. The people who carved this message 1,500 years ago wanted us to remember something crucial, she said to the camera. that the environment we inhabit is dynamic, not static, that cycles of abundance and scarcity are natural features of this landscape, and that survival depends on remaining flexible and attentive to patterns that unfold over timescales longer than individual memory. They carved this warning in stone because they knew we'd forget. The question now is whether we'll remember in time to matter. The documentary premiered at a film festival in Park City, won several awards, and was picked up by a major streaming platform. Millions of people watched it, many for the first time, confronting the reality that their water supplies were more precarious than they'd assumed. Social media filled with discussions about climate adaptation, infrastructure planning, and the value of Indigenous knowledge. Politicians in southwestern states faced questions about water management policies. The conversation shifted, slowly but measurably. Sarah found herself invited to speak at events far removed from academic archaeology. City council meetings, state legislative hearings, water management conferences. She repeated the same core message, adapting it for different audiences, but never compromising the fundamental points. The warnings had been ignored for too long. The patterns were clear in multiple independent data sources. Adaptation required acknowledging uncomfortable truths about resource limits and long-term planning. Not everyone was receptive. Development interests argued that pessimistic projections would harm economic growth. Some political leaders dismissed the research as environmental alarmism. Climate change skeptics claimed the entire premise was exaggerated. But slowly, the center of gravity shifted. More people understood that the question wasn't whether to adapt, but how quickly and thoroughly they could manage it. 6 years into the project, Sarah received an invitation from the Secretary of the Interior to brief federal officials on her findings and their implications for public lands management and water resources planning. She traveled to Washington with Michael and Thomas, feeling the weight of the opportunity and the obligation. This was a chance to ensure that the messages carved in stone would finally receive the attention they'd been meant to command. The briefing room was filled with officials from multiple agencies: Interior, Agriculture, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Reclamation. Sarah presented their findings, walking through the evidence methodically. She showed petroglyphs and explained their distribution patterns. She presented paleoclimatic data and demonstrated correlations with archaeological evidence of population movements. She outlined what ancestral populations had understood about environmental cycles and how that knowledge could inform contemporary planning. "What you're describing," said a deputy secretary, "amounts to a fundamental restructuring of how we approach water management in the West. The political and economic implications are staggering." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "But the alternative is to continue ignoring warnings until system failures force changes under crisis conditions. The people who carved these messages understood something we've forgotten: that short-term thinking in the face of long-term patterns is a strategy for disaster." Thomas spoke then, his voice carrying the authority of lived experience and inherited knowledge. "My ancestors left these warnings because they'd experienced what happens when people forget. Communities dispersed, complex societies collapsed, people died, and it took generations to recover. You have the opportunity to avoid repeating those patterns, but only if you're willing to listen to voices you've historically dismissed." The meeting lasted 4 hours, officials asking detailed questions about methodology, confidence levels, and policy implications. Sarah answered as honestly as she could, acknowledging uncertainty while emphasizing the strength of converging evidence. Michael provided linguistic and cultural context. Thomas reminded them repeatedly that this wasn't theoretical. These patterns had already begun manifesting in ways that were causing real hardship for real communities. The outcome was mixed. Some officials left clearly convinced that major changes were needed. Others remained skeptical or overwhelmed by the scale of what adaptation would require. But the conversation had happened at the highest levels of government, and that represented progress. The warnings carved into stone had finally reached ears capable of potentially responding. Over the following years, Sarah watched as various jurisdictions began implementing changes based partly on her research. Some were modest: revised estimates of sustainable water yields, updated reservoir management protocols, increased cooperation between states sharing river systems. Others were more significant: tribal nations given greater authority over water resources on their lands, traditional ecological knowledge formally incorporated into environmental impact assessments. Long-term planning horizons extended to match the temporal scales the petroglyphs suggested were relevant. It wasn't enough, Sarah knew. The changes were too slow, too incremental to fully address challenges that were accelerating, but they represented recognition that had been absent before, acknowledgement that the warnings had merit, and that recognition created space for further change. The project continued evolving. Sarah's team now included Indigenous scholars in leadership roles, ensuring that research priorities and interpretations reflected multiple perspectives. They documented over 15,000 petroglyphic panels across the Colorado Plateau, creating a database that researchers could mine for patterns. They'd published 3 books and dozens of papers. The work had become central to conversations about climate adaptation and cultural survival in arid lands. But Sarah still returned each summer to the canyon where it had all begun, to the warning stone that had first captured her attention. She'd bring students, teaching them to read the landscape as text, to see connections between past and present, and she'd stand before those ancient symbols, hand pressed against warm stone, thinking about the unnamed carver who'd worked 15 centuries ago to leave this message for the future. Had they succeeded? The message had been ignored for a long time, its urgency lost as cultural continuity frayed and knowledge systems collapsed. But now, finally, people were beginning to listen. Not everyone, not yet, but enough to matter. The warnings carved into stone were being translated into policy, into planning, into practice. It was imperfect and incomplete, but it was happening. On one such visit, Sarah brought her own daughter, now 12 years old and fascinated by her mother's work. They climbed to the warning stone together, Sarah pointing out symbols and explaining what they meant. "Why did they make these?" her daughter asked, small fingers tracing the carved lines. "Because they wanted us to remember," Sarah said. They'd learned things through hardship and experience, and they didn't want future generations to have to learn the same lessons the hard way. So they carved warnings in the most permanent medium they could find. But people ignored them. For a long time, yes. But now we're trying to listen. It's harder than it should be, because we've lost the cultural context that would have made these messages immediately understandable. But we're working to recover that knowledge and apply it to challenges we're facing today. Her daughter was quiet for a moment, studying the petroglyphs with serious concentration. "What if we're wrong? What if we're not understanding what they really meant? It was a good question, the kind that showed she'd inherited her mother's skeptical instincts. That's always possible, Sarah admitted. We have to be humble about interpretation, acknowledge uncertainty. But when multiple independent sources of evidence point toward the same conclusions, we can have some confidence we're seeing real patterns. The petroglyphs, the archaeological record, the climate data, they all suggest the same thing. This landscape experiences long-term cycles that require adaptation and flexibility to survive. They sat together on sun-warmed stone, looking out over the canyon landscape that had changed so little in visible ways, yet so profoundly in invisible ones. Sarah thought about cycles and warnings, about how knowledge gets lost and sometimes recovered. She thought about the unnamed carvers who'd worked to encode their understanding of the world, hoping someone in the distant future would pay attention. And she thought about her own obligation to translate those warnings into terms that contemporary society could understand and act on. The message carved into stone had been ignored for 15 centuries, its urgency invisible to people who'd lost the ability to read it. But now, finally, it was being heard. Not perfectly, not universally, but heard nonetheless. The question was whether that hearing had come soon enough to prevent the kinds of catastrophes the ancient warnings had been trying to help future generations avoid. Sarah didn't know the answer. The cycles were long, the challenges complex, the inertia of existing systems formidable, but the warnings were clear, carved by hands that had known hardship and urgency. And now, at last, people were beginning to remember that ignoring warnings didn't make them less true, only made the eventual reckoning more severe. The sun dropped toward the western horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah's daughter asked more questions, each one showing she was learning to see the landscape as more than scenery, as a text containing information crucial for survival. And Sarah answered, passing forward what she'd learned, continuing the chain of transmission that had been so nearly broken, but now, perhaps, could be restored. The message had been carved into stone and ignored for too long, but stone was patient, and warnings didn't expire. They waited, enduring through centuries of neglect, ready to be read whenever people finally developed the wisdom to listen. Whether that wisdom had arrived in time remained to be seen, but at least, now, finally, the conversation had begun. And that, Sarah thought, was what the ancient carvers had hoped for all along. Not that their warnings would prevent every hardship, but that someone, eventually, would remember that the knowledge existed, carved into stone and waiting to be understood. The rest would depend on what her generation and the ones that followed chose to do with that recovered understanding. The warnings were clear. The patterns were evident. The question now was simply whether people would adapt before the cycles they had ignored forced adaptation upon them in ways far more painful than voluntary change would have required. She stood, helped her daughter to her feet, and began the careful climb back down to the canyon floor. Behind them, the petroglyphs watched with the patience of stone, their warnings as relevant as they'd been when first carved, waiting for the future they'd tried so hard to prepare.